Hiya, welcome to Darren in the Studio. Thanks for swinging round for another video here in the studio. This video is the first of my 60th anniversary videos, because last year I didn't do a 1963. I didn't do a 60th birthday celebrations from albums of 1963, and I'll tell you why I didn't. I didn't do one for 1963 because I knew I would struggle to find albums within my collection that came out in 1963. Now, I know there are going to be hundreds of albums released in 1963, so I could have done a video, but I like to be honest here in the studio. I didn't want to sort of go through a 1963 video and then just have them popping up on the screen, you know, sort of in an edited fashion. I want to be able to physically show you the copies that I have. That's why I didn't do 1963 last year for its 60th birthday, because, like I say, I would have struggled to find enough to show for you in a video. And that's almost been the case for 1964 with this celebration, because I found that I have very, very few albums that came out in 1964. And the albums that I do have, there's not a lot of artists in here. There's, like, you know, a lot of these are sort of doubled up and things like that. So I've managed to get together 10 items, although it's only really 9 albums, and one of these albums is a bit of a cheat, so you'll have to bear with me. So we're celebrating 1964 and we're looking at 10 items. Sorry, the dog just put me off. That was the door squeaking. Keeps coming in and out. Are you right now? He's all right. 1964, I've got 10 items here, but really only 9 albums. And all these albums came out in 1964, or they have a 1964 connection, if you will. Now, like I said earlier, there will be those of you out there who are sort of saying, well, what about this album? And what about that album? What about this album, Darren? I haven't got it, okay? I only show what I've got. Excellent. Now that we've got that out of the way, we're going to start. These are all in alphabetical order, and I've also put them in year of release from alphabetical order. You'll see why in a minute. So we're starting off with B. Who can B possibly be? Well, of course, it's the Beatles. Now, the Beatles had 2 albums out in 1964. The first one came out in July of 1964, and it was this one, A Hard Day's Night. This, of course, I think the first 7 tracks feature on the film A Hard Day's Night, and the rest are sort of made up for the album. I think this is one of the first mono original CDs that came out, because subsequently some of these albums were remixed for stereo, but I think these came from the original tapes of the mono mixes. And it doesn't say on the CD itself when this issue came out. Now, usually they do, because I have 2 copies of this. I've also got this version, which is the stereo mix, which came out in 2002, I think. No, sorry, 2009 stereo reissue on CD. Features a nice little fuller booklet and a nicer presentation of the album itself. But like I say, I think this is one of the first of the original CDs that were issued by EMI Apple. Just a very basic CD. The booklet itself is quite basic as well. Got some, nothing sort of fancy, just a bit of reading material and just pictures on the back. So 1964, July of 1964, our first album celebrating 60 years is this, The Beatles, A Hard Day's Night. Okay, second Beatles album of 1964 was this one, and this was called The Beatles for Sale. And again, this is one of those early CD issues of this album. Very basic, I say basic artwork, I mean I think they just wanted to replicate as best they could the original albums. And again, the booklet's pretty basic. And you never see this anymore, do you? These sort of tells you how it was transferred and what, you know, whether it was analog to digital or digital and all that sort of stuff. They don't do that anymore. Again, this is also a mono version of the Beatles for Sale. 1964, celebrating 60 years this year. If you know more about these Beatles CDs, these older reissue versions, then do let me know in the old comments. Now here's the album I was talking about, which is a bit of a cheat, to be fair. This album is kind of making up the numbers, all right. This is Glen Campbell. Now, of course, Glen Campbell started his career around sort of as a singer-songwriter himself around 62, 63, 64. This album consists of material from 1963 and 1964. This is an album called The Two Sides of Glen Campbell. This is out on the Capitol label through EMI. I think this is a nice little UK pressing. It is. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, hang on a minute, Darren, if you know a thing or two about Glen Campbell, you'll be saying, that didn't come out in 1964, and you're right, it didn't. This album actually came out in 1973, but it features songs from 63 and 64. So the material on this is sort of 60 years plus old. And the reason I sort of chose it is because of that, and also all the compositions featured on this recording are actually instrumentals. And it gives a nice little flavour as to how good a guitar player Glen Campbell was. So, released in 1973, but featuring material from 63 and 64, Glen Campbell's Two Sides of Glen Campbell. Okay, next on the list of albums celebrating 60 years. This is an album that came out 60 years ago, but again, there's like a little, you know, a little caveat to go with this. This is a compilation of material, of hits. This is Elvis's Golden Records Volume 3. Now in the States, this was released in 1963, but in the UK, it was issued on RCA Victor in 1964. It's got a 1964 date on it. You see it just there. Nice little original pressing. This is a stereo pressing. I say original. This can't be an original 64, can it? Because, and why can't it? Because it's got the orange labels. But originally issued in the UK, because that's where I am. Originally issued in the UK, 1964, Elvis's Golden Records. I did tell you I struggled with 1964, didn't I? Okay, now here's somebody who 1964 was both a good year and a very, very bad year. You know, if you've watched my videos before, that I am a massive fan of Jim Reeves. I love Jim Reeves' music. And this year, 20 24 sees the 60th anniversary of the passing of Jim Reeves. He died in a plane crash July the 31st, 1964. And here's some of his recordings from 1964. This particular album was released in May of 1964. This is Jim's Moonlight and Roses. This is one of those albums that you will constantly see in charity shops all over the country, all over the world. And the reason you see so many of them is because he sold so many records. Jim Reeves was an absolute monster of a record seller. He did sell a lot of records, not only during his lifetime, but also since he passed away. So 1964, this album came out. This would have been Jim's last album within his lifetime. He sort of went into the studio and recorded more material, which came out a year after he passed away. But this was the last album within his lifetime. Jim Reeves, Moonlight and Roses, a lot of classics on here. Moonlight and Roses itself, Mexicali Rose, Carolina Moon is a beautiful track on here. What's in It for Me, 1 Dozen Roses, Moon River, beautiful. It's Only a Paper Moon. Moonlight and Roses, Jim Reeves celebrating 60 years this year, not only of this album, but of the passing of Jim Reeves. I think what we're going to have to do in July of this year is do a special Jim Reeves video, that is for sure. Also released in 1964, originally in 1964, was Jim Reeves's film Kimberly Jim. Now, this is the soundtrack album of Kimberly Jim, and this has got a 1966 date stamp on it, but the material itself was released in 1964, and I think this particular album in America and in South Africa was released in 1964. The reason why it was released in South Africa in 1964 is because the film came and was made in South Africa, and he was absolutely probably one of the biggest stars of all time in South Africa and continues to be so. This is the soundtrack album of his one and only film that he did. Hopefully, if we do a video, we will do a video in July about Jim. We'll go more into more detail. But it wasn't too bad in it. If you ever get a chance to check it out, Kimberly Jim featuring Jim Reeves, it's not a bad little movie at all. Got some nice little songs in it. Most of these songs were featured in the film, but some of them were recorded especially for this particular record. Kimberly Jim, 1964, celebrating 60 years this year. Next up, it's another Jim Reeves album, and this is a South African only release. We were just talking about South Africa and how famous Jim was in South Africa. This is a little album called Adios Amigos, and I have a feeling that this was probably issued after Jim died. Like I say, Jim Reeves was very, very popular all over the world, of course. He was probably more famous in South Africa and parts of Europe, like Norway and Ireland. Probably more famous in those countries than he was in his native America. But this is Adios Amigos. Adios Amigos. It's out on the RCA Victor label. Only issued in South Africa in 1964. This is on a nice little black spot RCA black label, which they tended to look like in South Africa. The ones in the UK and America and other Europe releases tended to have the RCA was a little red spot on the RCA. So another album celebrating 60 years is this one from Jim Reeves, Adios Amigos, and it's basically just a collection of some of his hits up to that time. Now the next one is again a Jim Reeves album, but this is a compilation that came out in 1964, and again, it's probably an album which came out after his passing. This is Have I Told You Lately That I Love You, another album that you'll find quite a lot in charity shops. This is a UK press of it, but I think it was first issued in America in 1963, I think, but it's got on here 1964. Just a collection of early stuff and more recent things. Another album of Jim Reeves that was released in 1964. Like I said, the year that he passed away, so he was also, not only was he very busy making a film and doing concerts, he was also busy recording, putting out albums, but sadly perished in a plane crash in July of 64. Next, and our last album of 1964 is the Rolling Stones, their first album. And again, this has some question marks, if you like, around the original date of release. Now, we know that this album came out in the UK in 1964. But I have a feeling, because this has a 1966 date on it, that could be one of two things. Number one, it could quite simply be a mistake, because this is a repress. This is a relatively new copy. I think this is the 2003 repress version of it, and this copy itself is newer than that. I've only had this a couple of 3 years. England's Newest Hit Makers, as far as I'm aware, wasn't its original title. Original title of this album was just The Rolling Stones. Then possibly 2 years later in 1966 they added this as a bit of a hype, if you will. Rolling Stones' first album, a lot of good stuff on here. Not Fade Away, Route 66, Just Want to Make Love to You. Some big hits on this already. Carol, the Chuck Berry song, You Can Make It If You Try, Walking the Dog. What was the there was a Jagger and Richard, yeah, Tell Me on here is a Jagger and Richards composition. England's Newest Hitmakers, the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones' first album, 1964, celebrating 60 years of the first Rolling Stones album. Now, I have a copy, an original copy of the Rolling Stones Volume 2, the second album that they put out, and that also has a 1964 date stamp on the cover, but on the label it's 64/65, because I think some of the material was released in 64, the back end of 64, and then in 65 the second album was released. So like that, this, the 66 that's stated on the label, could be a mistake, but Rolling Stones, the first album in the UK, was issued in 1964. That is it. That's our roundup of 1964. Do let me know the albums that you've got. Don't forget, these are the albums that I've got, because there will be people that will write something like, well, Darren, you forgot about this, and you forgot about that, and you forgot about that one. I didn't forget about them, I just don't have them. We're honest here at the studio. We only feature what we've actually got. So if you've got a favourite album of 1964, let me know in the comments. Add your views in the comments. We love hearing from you, and we do our very best to reply to all of them. Until we do another video, look after yourselves, look after each other, make sure you like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. And we'll see you in the studio for another video very, very soon. Take care. Ta-da.